Well, thanks for coming on out. I know it's early in what's going to be a long and exciting day here at Super BitCon. Awful lot of stuff. I want to get back out there and see stuff too, so I appreciate y'all coming out. I'm Scott Patterson. This is kind of what I do for a living, talk about video games in front of microphones and cameras, and that's what we're going to be doing this morning. And I am joined by...
My name is Brett Weiss. I'm the author of the Classic Home Video Game Series. You might have seen me pimping these on Facebook or social media or that kind of thing. 3 books so far in the series, and my booth is right out front if you want to talk about it further. Plus, I've got a new retro pop culture book that just covers a variety of pop culture features.
I'm Jeff Cooper. I teach history at Oklahoma State University, and I guess my claim to fame is that I've been collecting longer than anybody here. Wait a minute. All right. Yeah. There's some dissent here.
Well, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about this morning. You know, we've got an insanely awesome vendor area out there. There's stuff out there I haven't seen in years. And, you know, I mean, it's all 3 of us up here have been, you know, dabbling in that and picking up video game stuff before it was even called video game collecting. It was just called buying new cool stuff. And, you know, over time, you know, some of the stuff ends up in garage sales or ends up neglected or just used up, and, you know, prices fluctuate. I mean, I could, you know, shoot, we had all morning. I could tell stories. I remember digging through at a Funko Land and passing up on 3 copies of Stadium Events to get a copy of Double Dragon. You know, I was, you know, looking back now, you know, I mean, come on, but back then, who wanted to play that game? You know, so I mean, we're going to kind of talk about how things have changed and how, you know, certain items have become more collectible over time, and while some haven't, and kind of where this is going to go from here. I'll kick off with you, Brett. What do you think makes some of these items that maybe people looked over in the past collectible and valuable in here and now?
I think it has a lot to do with nostalgia and just what you enjoyed as a kid, but other than that, I think a lot of people appreciate the simplicity of the 2D games. I think a lot of the games that are just simple to plug in and play have gone up in value because people like to not only return to their childhood, but also just the simplicity. You just plug in the cartridge and start playing. You don't have to wait for downloads. You don't have to wait for console updates. You don't have to, you know, figure out what 20 different buttons are supposed to do. You just push, you know, a couple of buttons and boom, you're there. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. I think the factory sealed stuff that has skyrocketed in value. Part of that, I think some people are actually opening these games just to sort of re-experience what, you know, it's a cheap way. You think a $100 factory sealed NES game, that sounds expensive, but it's a lot cheaper than building a time machine and going back to 1986 and, you know, reliving your Christmas morning. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Just pure nostalgia, and just that the fact that the games have held up so well because of the simplicity.
Well, there are different levels of collecting, of course. Some people want to collect the games that they enjoyed as kids. That drives a lot of people, and they just want the cartridges. Then there are people who want to get every single game for a particular system mint in the box. What makes something collectible? Games like Contra at the NES, for the NES, which is available at my booth for like $24. That is extremely popular and collectible because it's a great game and everybody wants it. It's not particularly rare. Earthbound for the Super Nintendo. Very expensive game. It's not terribly rare. But then you have games that are highly, highly collectible simply because they're impossible to find, and then anybody who wants to complete a collection, they're going to need to get those games. The Panesian games for the NES are not particularly good, and they're not particularly racy. But if you want to complete your NES collection, you're going to have to go there. So those are some of the elements I see, you know, contributing to what makes something highly collectible.
Well, I think one of the differences too, as opposed to, let's say, other kinds of collectibles, whether it be posters or it be figurines or it be anything like that, video games, just by the way they were created in the first place, were meant to be consumed. They were meant to be used. They were meant to be played. And, I mean, all of us, at some point and another in the past, I'm sure almost everybody that collects something now has, a game or two or whatever that they threw around and they put through the dishwasher to clean and the label came off, or they threw the box away. And you look back now and you're like, oh my God, what did I do? But I mean, at the very heart, these were meant to be used, and therefore they get used up, as opposed to just something that was designed in the first place to go sit on a shelf.
Well, I remember in the late not 1880s, I'm not quite that old, the late 1980s, I had around somewhere between 60 and 80 ColecoVision games, and there were over 100 produced for the system. And I don't even know if I considered myself a collector. I was more of a haver and a game player, but I bought all the ColecoVision stuff I could find. And then I made the brilliant decision one day, these boxes sure are taking up a lot of space, so I threw them all away.
Yep.
Which probably cost me, I don't know, $4,000 or $5,000, considering some of the boxes were some of the very rarest games in existence.
Well, what would be the rarest thing that you had when you were younger that you wish you'd kept around or at least treated better?
Well, my mom burned my comic book collection because I left them on the floor too many times.
Burned it?
Yeah, burned it.
Nice.
How about you, Brett? What's the rarest thing you had, past tense, other than the box story you just told?
Well, my thing is, so much of it, I'm a writer full time, but I also supplement my income with setting up at shows and stuff. So when I find something rare in the wild or something, I'll usually sell it, and without regret, to pay the bills. So, but growing up, it's hard to say. I've had some most of like the Atari, ColecoVision stuff. I've kept most of that stuff, so I don't know that I have a really compelling story in that way.
The thing is that, like most people, I bought the good games, and the good games weren't particularly rare.
Well, that's interesting. The Atari 2600 rare games are usually pretty bad, but the real common ones are great. But with the Odyssey 2, the rare games are some of the better ones, like Turtles, Power Lords.
Yeah, it was the Odyssey 2, though. Everybody was in that in the first place. So
yeah,
part of the thing with that too.
But the common games for that system, a lot of them are pretty bad. but the rare games are all usually pretty good. Most of those are pretty good. So it's kind of a flip of the 2600.
But we can prove how inherently collectible these games are by pointing out that there was a very vibrant collectors community long before there was eBay, internet, or any prices attached to these games at all.
There was the Digital Press fanzine. I picked up the first edition of the Digital Press Collector's Guide, and I had those videos that Digital Press would show people with their collections, and that was well before any online stuff.
Well, and then that's one of the things that to me has been the most interesting change, because I mentioned before, probably very early 90s at a Funko Land. They just had a big shelf of NES games, and the NES at that time was kind of falling out of favor.
Right.
And
it was a buyer's market at that time.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to complete some items, and there were games that were on that shelf. Like I mentioned, stadium events. There were more than several. There were at least 3 copies of that sitting there. No one wanted that game when it was new, So just kind of going through, but that's what it was. Back then, there wasn't an internet. There wasn't anything like that. It wasn't an eBay. I remember having to go bounce around all over town. I would hit pawn shops. I remember passing a Vectrex at a pawn shop. I want to say probably around that same time, early to mid 90s, for $35. Because I had only but heard of the Vectrex. I had no idea. When I saw eBay years later, I rushed back there, but they didn't have it.
I had a very well-worn VCR that I traded to a pawn shop for a Gem Mint Vectrex console.
Nice move.
The Vectrex, that was one of my greats. It was probably around 89, 90, and I had just a spare VCR. And they had a Vectrex for like $25 that was just gorgeous, and just an even swap for a VCR. But you were asking me about things that I regretted selling. Not so much that, but what I remember is things I passed up. Just a few examples. Towards the end of the N64 life cycle, every GameStop you would go into would have stacks and stacks of Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Yes.
Tons of them factory sealed for $9.99 each. I bought one, put it on my shelf, played it. It's a cool game, and no other. Now that game factory sealed goes for well over 100. Complete, 100, maybe more factory sealed, maybe more than that.
Right.
And Ikaruga for the GameCube. They closed that out for $15 each. Now that factory sealed goes for about 100. And dating back further, you would go to KB Toys in the mid to late 80s. There were bins of games, namely the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision third-party games that weren't necessarily that great, and just tons of them for $2, $3, $4, $5, just blowing them out. I bought one of each thing I could find, which mostly I still have except for the boxes. And you could have, if you would have known then. So how does that translate to now? Right now, Xbox, PS2, you can find common games, complete gem mint games for those systems for PS1, PS2, Xbox, $2.99, $3.99. Going to GameStop and other places, so cheap. So are you going to go buy stacks and stacks of those? Probably not. But 10, 20 years from now, who knows? The same thing could happen.
Well, that's so throw it over to you on this one. Now that we do have the internet, we have eBay, we have Game Gavel, we have all these options, all these things, and all these groups that we can go online and complete collections, sometimes without even leaving the house. So how does that change the game? No pun intended, haha. No, how does that change the collecting game versus what it was when we didn't have all those things at our disposal and with these modern consoles? Because as you mentioned, these more recent consoles, in time, there's going to be gems on those too that are going to end up being valuable. We don't know what they are yet, but I mean, how does that change things from what it used to be?
I don't know. I guess it depends on how people choose to approach collecting. I mean, with the internet now, in any given day, you can find what it would take you months and months and months to find out in the wild.
I remember when I first got online and saw a ColecoVision website, and I was blown away by how many games there were and how many devoted fans there were. I was like, you're just stunned.
And the change is so dramatic, and the change in collecting is so dramatic. Brett, you were talking about the things that you passed up. Did you ever dream that there would be significant monetary value attached to these games?
None whatsoever. As a matter of fact, at the time, all this stuff, as soon as a console would go out of favor or get aged or the next one would take its place, I remember in high school, a guy in like 1983, around that time, when the 5200 and ColecoVision were the big thing before the crash, this guy gave me his Atari 2600 with like 10 games for like $10. I mean, he just said, take it. For a lot of people, as soon as the next generation of systems would come out, the older stuff was just considered junk. I mean, people would laugh at you if you had that and played it. Yeah. And so it was a buyer's market. It was so easy to...
Absolutely. And the thing is, not all of that stuff got tossed in the closets or garages or whatever either. Unfortunately, everyone knows, everyone should know, there was a big crash in the mid-'80s. These stuff had no value. You could even buy games new in the stores then for just a couple of bucks, and some of them tried to clear it out. Some of these things got thrown in attics and closets, dragged out later, and ended up out in an event like this. Other stuff got passed on maybe to the younger generations who didn't appreciate it as much, and they used it up, and they got rid of it. Some people, I literally know some people that just tossed it in the trash.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I ran across a gentleman a couple years ago that did that. He'd asked me, he had an old Donkey Kong machine in his garage. He asked me to go fix for him. And he apparently was a big video game family in the early to mid 80s. And he told me, he was trying to remember the name of it. He told me, hey, Atari 5200 and all these cartridges, and he'd kept them up and whatever, and then eventually he just, okay, this is old, and he told me, he even pointed to the trash can at the curb. He just threw it away. He thought, nobody wants this stuff anymore. And I mean, that's the thing, is that, you use it, you try to take care of it, but you just don't know. And I think all of us have had those boneheaded things. But one more thing, because this is a little short, and would like to discuss some things with y'all as well. I'm very interested in this particular topic. This is a very hot topic right now. is going forward. You mentioned the consoles going forward. Is more and more games now are being digital downloads, and it's pretty obvious to me, with even just the way like things like the Xbox One are set up, that in time they're looking at just kind of phasing out the idea of physical copies in the first place. I think all media is going that way. Clearly, music's almost already there, and movies and
but
all
not
that
books.
follow.
Books are still
Books. Yeah.
Books
But eventually,
dead.
eventually, it's clear to me. Eventually, their mission is that games are going to be digital download primarily, if not exclusively. I'll start with you on this one, Jeff. How do you think that is going to impact collecting in the future for these more what we consider current gen consoles now?
I wish I knew.
Well, I mean,
I could see.
do you think maybe the console with a rare game downloaded will have more collectible value because maybe that game isn't available on a physical copy? But we have a copy of this downloaded on this console. Do you think that'll do that?
I am very curious. First of all, I totally agree with what Scott is saying, that the direction is for digital games and there will not be physical copies. And what is this going to mean for our hobby? All the cartridges that we own, and even the discs that we own. I could see where that would mean it's only going to be a good thing if you're a collector, but I can't predict the future on that.
Yeah,
that does
it's
seem
real
logical.
tough it's hard to say. I mean, if more people could predict how the collecting thing was going to go, you'd have a lot more millionaire collectors. I mean, really tough to see. I can see the older stuff maintaining its value. I mean, if you look at the comic book industry, people that don't currently read the new stuff, that's $4 per issue, and the downloadable comics are getting increasingly popular. The Silver and Golden Age stuff has done nothing but gone up. There's no
That's a great
shortage.
comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, Action Comics #1 in near mint condition, $2 million plus is what it's worth now. So.
And that was something people used up and threw away. And I think you touched. You touched on something there too. And then we'll spin it to a Q&A thing here, because I do think some of those Silver and Golden Age comics, they continue to go up because those characters and those stories have gone beyond just. Originally they were just supposed to be something to make a little bit of money, and those characters became pop culture. They became...
Yeah, it was purely disposable then. I mean, comic books in particular, the original art for the old comics was traditionally just thrown in the trash.
Yes.
Because a lot of the creators were sort of ashamed to be working on comics because they're sort of viewed as video games were in the early 80s, just a sort of juvenile junk that was...
sometimes.
Yeah, still are now. Video games are often seen as, sort of a lesser form of entertainment than... film or music or whatever.
Yeah, but I don't think it's always going to be that way, and I think you're kind of seeing that now. Where there's no doubt, no one can argue that Mario extends beyond video games.
Yeah, we're talking the digital version of Mickey Mouse. Basically.
Yeah, I mean those extend beyond just being video games and actually being pop culture. And I think that is one thing that's key to look at with anything to see maybe where it goes is what transcends.
One might say retro pop culture.
Is what transcends just the medium itself and becomes pop culture and something that shapes, because pop culture shapes all the other forms of entertainment as well. So we got anything more you'd like to say on that before we spin it to the Q&A here?
I think the one thing I wanted to touch upon was the variability of collecting in terms of people who are collecting cartridges versus people who are collecting things completely in the box. I wanted to share the story that I collected stuff from the 1960s, and I had a few lava lamps, and I was at a flea market. Guy had a lava lamp in the box, and I said, I already got a lava lamp, but I'll give you $5 for the box. And he burst out laughing. And he gave me a little lecture. He said, you have to understand, with any old toy, the box is worth way more than the toy. And explained the logic. The boxes got thrown out. And I took that to heart, and that's why I figured as long as I'm going to collect video games, then I might as well make these things collectible, truly collectible, by collecting the boxes.
Well, collecting wasn't even a thing until the 60s. I mean, prior to that, older stuff did not go up in value traditionally. I mean, maybe some fine furniture, maybe some like genuine antiques, like if you had like a, the Declaration of Independence or something, obviously that was going to be valuable. But just like, but just, pop culture items, stuff like that. I mean, in the 1950s, if you had a copy of Action Number 1, you'd get, a dime for it. I mean, collecting as a thing, pop culture-wise, really didn't start until the 60s and into the 70s. In the 30s and 40s, there's a guy named Forrest J. Ackerman that published Famous Monsters of Filmland. He went around in Hollywood to all the dumpsters, rescuing one-sheets and posters and lobby cards and all this stuff, scripts, just because it was all thrown away, just considered junk. And now that's, he became a multimillionaire because of that.
Well, I that, but he did something that's almost a greater thing to that medium as well, though, besides just, making the money for himself, is that he preserved stuff that would otherwise be lost.
Absolutely.
I'm going to rush through this part a little bit so we can get to the Q&A, because one thing I've noticed with video game collecting is that it almost has a complete parallel to collecting things in sports and films, movies, that sort of thing. Because video games, the first consumer video games first started coming out in the early 70s, and they really didn't even catch on huge, of course, until later on in that decade. It took a long time for film. For example, film went through about a 40-year period there when it first kind of started up. It was considered bubblegum, throwaway, junk entertainment. Posters, even original films and all that got scrapped. Same thing with TV history. The first TV shows, a lot of those TV shows, we have missing episodes or even entire series that are very rare because they were just made to be shown one time and tossed.
Yeah, over half of the films made before like 1950 something are gone. Are completely gone.
That's what it is with video games too, is that when you collect something, it's not just adding something cool for the shelf and to share on Instagram to your friends. You're actually preserving a piece of video game history that may have otherwise ended up in a landfill somewhere or butchered by some guy on eBay to turn it into a clock or something stupid like that. We're preserving history of this entertainment medium that we all love. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't love. And I think that is vital, and I wish more people would look at it that way. But we're
one thing, Scott, I wanted to add. I spoke with a panel of video game designers, people who worked on Atari stuff in the 1980s, and I asked them, did you ever have a sense that you were designing a game for the ages, or that 30 years later people would still be playing Pitfall, or that people would collect these things? And they were unanimous. They had no clue.
All the comic book creators said the exact same thing.
Yeah, they never dreamed that anyone would be playing this stuff 30 years later. They said, look, we had 5 months to crank a game out, and that's the only thing we were thinking about.
Right.
Never dreamed that people would be playing them or collecting them.
Let's throw a little Q&A here. We got about 15 minutes or so to be able to do that. I always like to do that so we can make sure we're talking about things that are important to y'all as well. Who wants to kick it off? I'm the open forum here. Who wants to? You were very enthusiastic, so go for it. Well, I'll kick off on that one. I've always loved this stuff. The first thing, I was a little kid when I first started gaming. It was 1981, and a lot of things. I'd come across a lot of things at that young age that I liked, and a lot of things that came later that I liked. But video games were the only thing that really jumped out. Like, boom! I really dig this. This is really what I'm into, and it just never left me. And I became so fascinated with the games themselves. I wanted to know how they got made, who made them, what's the story on this, what's the stuff on this. And in searching for that sort of thing, I started going to thrift stores. I started going to flea markets and pawn shops and half-price books and getting this old stuff to learn that. And a lot of the old stuff ended up becoming collectible. And I just didn't want to let it go. And just over time, I actually found out that there's actually places interested in having me write about and talk about this sort of stuff that I've been studying this whole time. And I can actually, eke out a living doing it. So I'm lucky in that regard. I get, all that time wasn't wasted, first of all, but I get to talk about and write about and stuff I love, something I've always loved.
Well, I grew up just loving to read and play pinball. And in the mid-'70s, late '70s, my brother and I would go to the pinball, to the arcades and just play tons of pinball. And when Gunfight and Breakout and all these games, Space Invaders and all this stuff started coming in, I was like, wow, this is even cooler than pinball. And so we would play pinball, pop games, and sell those games so we'd have enough money to play video games. And I also grew up liking the Guinness Book of World Records, and I sort of combined my love for video games with my love for reading and liking reference books. And so I decided there's a Leonard Maltin book for movies, there's political guides for, if you want to look up politicians, there's plenty of books on that, plenty of books on actors, actresses. But at the time, when I started doing these in like 2006, there's no reference books that have every game for every console. It just didn't exist. For every other medium, there's plenty of that, thousands of that. But with video games, I decided to be the Leonard Maltin of video games, and so I started writing the reference guides. So it sort of comes from a love of reading and reference books.
And doing something that wasn't filling a need that
wasn't
already
a market that just wasn't, there was nothing like it.
My story is a lot like Scott's. I just love video games. I would have gotten my degree 2 years earlier if not for video games. And again, we're going back in time where you could go to flea markets and thrift stores and they were out there, and I just got the idea this would be a really, really fun thing to collect. And that's how I got started. Money really wasn't a part of the equation. And you didn't even know what you were doing. There weren't any rarity guides.
You were just having fun and playing games.
And
really.
Getting what you liked.
Yeah, if you saw a game you didn't have and that you thought you'd like, you bought it.
I wish I had liked Stadium Event.
Yeah,
I would have grabbed that. Sorry, that's forever hurts me.
But that's a great question.
Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
So collecting seems to have exploded a lot in the last few years. Do you fear that it may crash increasing so quickly, or do you think it's just going to
It's hard to tell. For a number of years, even though video game was always my thing, I did a toy collectible business. I did that before eBay. I would go set up at shows, and I'd get the chase figures, and I'd get the old stuff, Star Wars, Transformers, all that sort of thing. And, while that whole thing the whole bubble for that whole thing never busted, there were some lines that would increase suddenly and then stop. Some that would bomb out. Starting lineups, for example. Starting lineups where he's nodding. You probably got a closet full of them too, don't you? Those things would seem like they were red hot at one point, and then just boom, no one wanted them anymore.
Well, that seems to have not happened yet with video games.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. I think where it's going to go. I don't think you'll ever see a total bust of that.
Certain items may go down, though.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an ebb and flow. Sometimes it's also influenced by outside factors, though, too. I mean, you might have something. One of the things I can think of actually was arcade game collecting, which I've done off and on since back in the 90s when those things were literally considered junk. The operators just wanted to get rid of them for $100, $200. You get Frogger machines all day long at that point. For nothing. Nobody wanted Frogger.
Yeah, perfect condition. I remember that. 150, $200, easy.
Then that episode of Seinfeld came out, and suddenly Frogger was collectible and valuable.
That's a good point.
And so that's another thing to keep in mind and kind of look for. Right now, of course, NES, 16-bit, that sort of stuff is red hot too. I think that will slow down in the following years. I don't think it'll ever bust, but I think it'll slow down because the reason it's so hot right now is because the demographics, the ones that grew up, the people who grew up playing those as kids, they're now reaching that age where they're getting a little nostalgic and they got a little disposable income, they got a little more money in their pocket, and they're spending it on that. And that will slow down a little bit in time, and we'll probably end up moving on in time to the first PlayStation and Xbox games.
The Atari 2600 kind of peaked, about 6-7 years ago?
Yeah, that's
and it's kind of cooled off and leveled out.
The Atari 2600 provides a very good example here. The common cartridges, the semi-common cartridges, and the semi-rare cartridges, if anything, they've gone down in value. But the very rare cartridges and things in the box have either held their value or they've gone up.
Yeah, the rarest of the rare stuff
I think we can learn something from that.
Keeps its value. That's the same in all collectors.
Well, I also think, though, too, so far, video gaming has avoided a pitfall that toys and comic books and sports cards had, which is putting out these super collectible editions and with the fancy
manufactured
foil boxes
rarity, like pseudo rarity.
Well, if everybody, things become collectible not just based on how many were made, but how many are still around, and how many are still around in good condition.
And how many people want them?
The
desirability.
The stuff that people passed up on in clearance bins, like he's talking about, or Funko Land, like I talked about, or that's the stuff that ends up getting a little value later on. But comic books, for example, fell on that because people were grabbing some of the comic books when they were coming out. I remember people that were buying dozens of copies of Death of Superman going, oh, this will be valuable, how is it ever going to be valuable? Everybody kept it mint in some sealed, cryogenically frozen box somewhere, thinking it's going to be worth $1 million someday, so it's never going to be. It's the stuff that's not obvious that becomes valuable later on, and so far, for the most part, video gaming has avoided that. And of course, the older stuff doesn't have that in the first place. So, I mean, I think as long as it kind of avoids trying to create collectability, which is basically more just hyperbole than collectability, I think that you won't have a huge pop like you did with sports cards, comic books, stuff like that.
The modern publishers are releasing limited edition stuff, but it hasn't. You don't have people speculating on it necessarily. Yeah. You have hardcore fans of that particular game buying that set, the collector's edition.
Yeah, the people are buying those collector's editions, and they're taking it out of the box, and they're setting it all up and all that sort of stuff. But you're right, they're not. I don't hear people going and buying 10 copies of the Titanfall collector's edition and sticking them in a storage bin somewhere.
And one thing that I really like about video game collecting and the fact that prices go up, it's not just rarity, it's that people have a passion about these games. Like when Genesis was on the down cycle, like when the Genesis was being phased out toward the end of its run, at Funkoland / GameStop, you could get boxed complete Genesis games for dirt cheap, like Gunstar Heroes. I bought my copy for $2.99 at GameStop. Boxed mint. But people love that game so much, and it's built this, through YouTube videos and everything, it's built this reputation that $50-$60 probably for a complete Gunstar Heroes, just based on what a great game it is, and it's relatively hard to find.
Genesis stuff is still underpriced, and
I agree with that.
Brett brought up the idea of speculating. I did a little speculating when I decided to collect Super Nintendo, because I kind of ended with Nintendo. When I started collecting Super Nintendo, I didn't do what most people did, which was try to very quickly amass a collection of 300 or 400 games. Instead, I researched to find out what are the rarest games, and I started there, and I got them in the box, and then I went backwards getting the commons. That worked out very, very well. If I were to get very seriously into Sega Genesis collecting, which I might, I do the same thing. I would try to get stuff complete in the box and go for the rarest ones first, because the common stuff you can always fill in.
I think we got realistically time for one more. You, sir.
You mentioned the way that media has been kind of evolving, that's actually affecting collections, the way that print media is going, do you see how what all these print magazines like Nintendo now are being put that are no longer printed anymore?
That's a great question.
Do you see those being more, or people working on that nowadays? The way it's going to websites?
Well, to some. I mean, obviously now we've got a younger generation that they're used to getting their video game news just on the net. There's not that anticipation anymore of waiting for that new issue to show up in the mailbox or hoping it popped up in the store. And not just Nintendo Power. Remember EGM? I mean, they started putting out issues that seemed like they were that thick. It was always the super biggest, greatest edition ever. And I mean, we'd spend a week looking at that thing. But I mean, some of that seems to wax with nostalgia. The younger generations maybe not as impressed by print magazines as those of us who grew up anticipating and buying those and stuff like that. And even I threw some of that stuff out over time because I had so damn much of it. Having no idea, that the world would change as it has. I have seen some go up in value. One thing that comes to mind actually was an industry magazine for more of the coin-op industry, Replay and Play Meter magazines and stuff like that, because those were, of course, a lot smaller circulation and more for like in the industry. And then once that became old news, those operators would throw them out, junk them. In those pages is not just a bunch of cool old flyers and pictures and stuff, but it's actually like video game history as it happened, as it was going on. And that, to me, I go after stuff like that because I'm trying to preserve that sort of stuff. Because sometimes there's stuff in there I haven't even seen. You're not going to find it on Wikipedia or whatever yet. Someone's got to preserve that stuff. And some stuff like the Nintendo Powers, I've noticed, probably the most common issue was the very first one. I mean, they practically gave it to you if you woke up and brushed your teeth that day.
They were free at Toys R Us.
Yeah, but that still holds a value to some because most of us, of course, either looked through them so many times they fell apart or we tossed them out eventually.
Scott, I'm told that Nintendo Power #1 is skyrocketed in value.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that speaks to your question.
Yeah, and I think that's pure nostalgia. And it's some neat things. I think one of the neatest things, I think it may be the very first issue. If you look in the score section, Cliffy B has got a score in there. So, I mean, you get little tidbits like that. I also think some of that might be hurt by the fact that those things are scanned and available online, too.
Yeah.
So
that's hurt the collector's market some for those. But did any of you guys grow up reading Electronic Games magazine, the original? Yeah. Excellent magazine, tremendous production values and everything. I could not, and there was Joystick and a bunch of imitators, and a lot of them were really good. I grew up with not a lot of money, so I would go to Safeway, Albertsons, Skag, it was called Skaggs back then. I would stand at those newsstands all day and just read every single issue that was on display there, and I would buy some when I could.
All the little cards would fall out onto the floor.
Right, exactly. I'd end up with a stack of them eventually, but I just read them to pieces. And the interesting thing is, after the video game market crash, there was a span of probably 4 or 5 years where there were 0 video game magazines being published.
That's a terrible void.
Like from 85 to late 88, there were 0. So Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Super Mario Brothers, there were no contemporary reviews published of those games and the ones released around that time. There was a newsletter put out by a store in California, I think. That was the only publication going on at the time, and that was just a newsprint thing. But actual video game magazines, there was none. So it's interesting to think that all these incredible trailblazing NES titles that came out, Zelda and the like, there was 0. You looked at the box at the store, you looked at the back of the box. Every once in a while, there would be a store that would have a display where you could actually play it. But based on the box art alone and the occasional commercial, you would buy your game.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's one thing. And the rare things that did. I think it was I read an article online a few weeks ago. Somebody actually found what they believe is like at least the first, maybe the only review of Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah, that was in that newsprint magazine. It was a newsletter distributed by, what is the name of that store, Jeff?
It was called the Video Game Update.
Yeah, the Video Game Update. That was the only print print. Of course, it was print, but that was the only publication in the mid to late 80s that wrote anything about video games.
It had no advertising. It was about 30 pages long, and that is
the only contemporary Super Mario Brothers review in existence.
It spanned the Atari generation and the Nintendo generation, and the gap in between that covered Commodore 64 and things like that during the crash.
And the thing is with that is that I think in time, much as, and he alluded to this earlier, and we'll have to wrap it up on this, is film history is respected now. It's a respected thing. People respect music history, they respect sports history, and they're starting to respect video game history. It's still a long road, really a long fight to get there. And I think in time, things like that will be very valuable as those types of things, because it's not just, it's, point of conversation, they reviewed Super Mario Brothers. I mean, Super Mario Brothers was clearly a game that is huge and will always resonate, just like I Love Lucy will always resonate in television history, and Gone with the Wind will always resonate in film history. It's that level of thing for video games, and it's just, time will tell. It really just matters when the mainstream wakes up a little bit more and realizes this is just as viable of an entertainment art form as all of that, and the history is just as important.
I wonder what these conventions are going to mean to mainstream media, when they're going to take notice that in cities throughout the nation, thousands of people are coming to these conventions. I don't think the mainstream media has any idea how big this retro gaming thing is right now.
It's starting to snowball now. Like in the 60s, comic book convention, like the first San Diego Comic-Con, now there's 150,000 people that go, and they cut it off. The very first one, I think it was in 71, there were 300 people there. Yeah. And it's obviously,
video games will get there. Well, we're out of time. I don't want to take up the next panel's time too much, but I want to thank everybody for coming out.
Thanks very much for coming out.
Questions. Have fun. Enjoy this. Go complete your collections. And
One more thing. Right outside the door there is my booth. All my books are available. Please feel free to stop by. Jeff is near me as well. He's got a lot of rare box stuff. Check it out. And thank you for coming.
Thanks, Scott.
No problem. I saw
Scott,
that.